Friends, any serious debate on Singapore's economic policies has to start with the basic realities of the world we live in. Whatever we are talking about, how to create jobs, how to help low-income workers, how to make sure that we upgrade cleaners' jobs, security jobs, technicians' jobs, whatever economic issue we talk about, whatever we want the government to do, we have to start with the basic reality of the world we are in. And it is a world that is very different from where we were 5 years ago, and a world that will be very different 10 years from now compared to where we are today. And I must say, quite frankly, that I've been surprised by the complete absence of recognition of the basic realities of the world in both the manifestos as well as the speeches that I've heard the various opposition parties come out with in the last week. I was in Washington 2.5 weeks ago to attend the meetings of the IMFC. IMFC is a policy committee of the IMF. Had a lot of conversations with finance ministers, central bank governors, and I can tell you the mood was downbeat. These are not people who are congenital pessimists, but the mood was downbeat, and it was more downbeat today compared to 1 year ago. There's a very real risk of a setback in the global economy that will affect not just the US and Europe, but even the rapidly growing economies in Asia. As Bob Zoellick, the World Bank president, put it after our meetings, the world is one shock away from another major crisis. There are many reasons for this, and some of you are standing in the sun, so I don't want to get into great detail on them, but basically, the problems that led to the crisis are not over. The problems of excessive household debt, the problems of governments that have overborrowed, and the problems of banks that are themselves in a very fragile state are not over. And these problems will be with us for several years to come. In fact, the markets are now greatly concerned about government debt, especially in Europe, but also some other parts of the world. And it's not just about peripheral economies. Even the larger economies, the US and Japan, are now projected in a matter of 3 or 4 years to be at risk of a downgrade in their credit rating. Very serious risk, because they had overborrowed before the crisis, and during the crisis they had to spend a lot more, and their debts shot through the ceiling. They will now have to go through a wrenching period, a very painful period, for several years to come, in order to get their budgets back into decent shape, repay debts in an orderly fashion without the markets getting major shocks. That's just governments. Banks, likewise. Not very well known, but about 1/3 of European banks are short of capital by a very significant margin. And a significant proportion of global banks are going to have to renew their debt over the next 2 years, meaning they had borrowed and the debt now needs to be repaid over this year and next year, but they need to renew their debts. They can't simply repay, which means they have to raise new money. They will have to raise $3.5 trillion in the next 2 years. So when you put those two things together, the fact that government debt is now in perilous shape and bank debt is also a serious worry, you can understand why the markets are watching this very closely. Because the moment there's one problem with one government, whether it's in Europe or elsewhere, there'll be repercussions for the banks, especially the weaker banks. And we're not talking about 5 or 10% of banks, but 30 or 40% of banks that operate today. And these will be shocks that will be propagated quickly and widely across the global economy. That's one set of problems. Then, post-crisis, after the crisis, we have a new set of problems. Inflation is on the rise all over the world. Commodity prices are moving up sharply. Oil prices, everyone watches it. No one can tell what will happen in the Middle East, but no one can rule out a significant increase in oil and other commodity prices in the next year or two. And when you add that new risk to the old risks that are still with us, you have a world economy that is, as Bob Zoellick says, one shock away from another major crisis. There is a more fundamental challenge that doesn't have to do with shocks, doesn't have to do with temporary setbacks in the next 1 or 2 years, but a fundamental challenge that we all have to face for the next 10 years. There is a change that's happening in the global economy that is once again being driven by China. China, which 20 years ago reshaped global manufacturing by proving to be far more competitive in low-end manufacturing with low wages, is now once again reshaping both manufacturing and services, not at the low end, not at the low wage end, but in medium and higher value activities. Wages are moving up in China very rapidly, but productivity, skills, knowledge is moving up even faster. So all down the coast, from Dalian in the north, down to Guangzhou, down to Shenzhen, you have a set of cities with enterprising people, hardworking people, highly skilled, lower wages than the advanced countries, including lower wages than us. And this is going to be a fundamentally new challenge, different from the last 20 years, because it means that it's not just the blue-collar worker in manufacturing who's at risk, but white-collar jobs, both in manufacturing and services, and high-value-added jobs all over the world. It's a reality. We can't change it because China is progressing, and behind China you've got India, Brazil, some of the Eastern European economies also catching up. We can't change that reality. We have to cope with it, adjust to it, and find a way to thrive and prosper even with this challenge. This is a real problem in the advanced economies. There's a risk of wages stagnating for another decade. They already stagnated in the last decade in the US and Europe. There's a risk now of stagnation for at least another decade. And we must avoid this. We in Singapore have avoided it, and we must continue to avoid this. Which means thinking very hard, not just about what we do internally in Singapore, but how we can make sure that every Singaporean, whatever job they do, can continue to earn more than what they earn in China, more than what they earn in countries around us, and in fact, can continue to catch up with the most developed countries. That is key to our strategy, the PAP strategy for the future. Avoid the stagnation of the developed countries, continue to catch up, and make sure that everyone moves up in Singapore so that man for man, woman for woman, we earn more and we have a better life than that in the developing countries of the world, and we avoid the problems in the West and in the advanced economies. I have to say, because I've been listening to some of the speeches, that things in Singapore have not been stagnant. In fact, if you look at the average worker, if you look at the low-income worker, there's been significant change in just the last 5 years. The median worker in Singapore, and you have to remember that in the US and Europe and elsewhere, Japan, the average worker has seen no increase in wages after discounting for inflation in the last 10 years. In Singapore, we had a significant increase in the last 10 years. It doesn't mean everyone, but it means the average worker has seen a significant increase in the last 10 years. And I don't want to get into a whole load of data, but let me just give you a basic fact, which is that The average worker, the opposition has been using this term median worker, which is very good, it's the right concept. The average worker, the median worker, has seen incomes grow by 25% in nominal terms in the last 5 years, 2005 to 2010, and even after minusing inflation, that's 10%. It is not good enough. And in the next 10 years, we want 10% to become 30%, a 30% improvement in real living standards. But in the last 10 years, we did better. Not just better than the US and the advanced economies, but even better than the economies that are in the same position as us. Hong Kong, Korea, Taiwan. In fact, if you look at Hong Kong, the median workers' incomes grew by 4% in real terms, Korea by 2%, Taiwan minus 3%. They're all in the same boat as us. Same challenge from China, same challenge of global competition, but we've managed to get more of our boats afloat and more of our boats to lift higher. And we must keep that up. Even the low-income worker in Singapore saw a lift. Not everyone, and I'll come to that in a minute, but most low-income workers, as Ong Yi Kung was saying, have seen a lift in incomes in the last 5 years. If you take an HDB 3-room family, both because of jobs, more jobs being created, and because wages have moved up, the HDB 3-room family, the average family in a 3-room flat, saw an increase in incomes of 28% over the 5 years, after minusing off inflation, still 14%. And it's not everyone. There are those who have not seen a wage increase. There are some who have even seen a reduction in wages. There are some people for whom day-to-day living is a real challenge, and we have to find the best way to help them. But let's start any debate by first not ignoring the basic facts. The basic facts are that the average Singaporean and the average low-income Singaporean has seen a lift in incomes and livelihoods. There are also people who have not seen a lift in incomes and livelihoods whom we need to do more to help. And we must do it in a way that truly helps them in the face of global competition that is going to be severe, which means strategies that really grow our economy, keep it diversified, strategies that upgrade skills across the board for the low-income technician and worker to the middle-income professional, whether it's a lawyer or an actuarian or a software programmer. Everyone must get a massive upgrade in skills in the next 10 years. And we have the resources to help you get there. And we must redistribute. The government has to continue to be fair in redistributing its revenues and resources to help the poor and the middle-income groups more. That is, in fact, what we've been doing, and we intend to do more. We've enhanced workfare. This year, we've increased our educational bursaries. We are aggressively subsidizing any form of training, find every possible way of helping those who are lower down to catch up and come up. Whatever we do, let's avoid thinking in polar terms. Let's avoid thinking in simple black and white terms or extreme terms. We have an economy with an unemployment rate of 2% or less, very different from the advanced economies where it's 8 to 10%, and in fact, in the peripheral European economies, 20%. We have an economy that's seen median income growth fairly significant, unlike the rest of the advanced economies, and in fact better than the NIEs. We have an economy where the government is able to afford, not just in the last 5 years, but in the next 10 years, the government is able to afford continuing help and subsidies for all Singaporeans who are low income and middle income, and we're able to do more because we've got a solid budget. We've got a revenue base, we've avoided debts, and we've kept our reserves growing for the long term through Temasek and GIC. That is how we must continue to run our economy and our policies for the next 10 years. Nothing is cast in stone, nothing perfect, but let's keep centering our policies on what really counts. Raising living standards for all, avoid spending without the resources, avoid spending that will lead to higher taxes. Thank you very much.